الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء، واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم، ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة بدعة، وكل بدعة ضلالة، وكل ضلالة في النار. أما بعد، فإن الله سبحانه وتعالى يقول في كتابه الكريم، يختم بهذه الآية سورة الفرقان، يقول مخاطبا نبيه صلى الله عليه وسلم: قل ما يعبأ بكم ربي لولا دعاؤكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in the Quran, He commands him and directs this order to him to convey these words to everyone, to convey these words to his nation. قُلْ مَا يَعْبَأُ بِكُمْ رَبِّي لَوْلَا دُعَاؤُكُمْ. Say to them that my Lord finds no value in you all. He is not, you do not have any of His attention or any merit with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if not but for your worship of Him. And so in this verse, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is commanded to articulate this meaning and to drive it in to the hearts and minds of all of his nation. Those who believe, those who disbelieve, that all of those who are to hear of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or see him or meet him, this general meaning is to be articulated to this person in one form or another. You see, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to say something, to convey, say to them, it doesn't always just mean that he is to merely recite the verse to them. It doesn't just mean that he is to exactly say the wording to his nation or his companions or whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is directing his words towards. But rather, he is to not only say it, but to implement it, to convey the meanings that this verse holds in many forms, in different words, but to convey that meaning and to drive it home in the minds and hearts of those who hear of him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One of the most important things that we have been taught with regards to our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our relationship to our existence, why we exist, why we are here, who are we, who we belong to. All of this roots back to some general principles and very simple answers to very complex questions. For instance, one of the things that we are told in many, many ways over and over throughout the Quran, throughout the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are told constantly in different ways, whether that be by way of stories that are told to us of previous prophets and messengers, or stories that are told to us in the Quran of previous individuals who went against the grain, and those who disbelieved in the prophets and messengers, those who were enemies to Allah and his messengers. Whether we are told this meaning by way of examples or parables or reward, etc., we find that if we boil it all down and take the moral of what is being told to us, there are a few most key points that are being made over and over and over again in the Quran. It's the same things being said constantly, but in different ways. One of those is the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have created not the jinn kind and the human kind except so that they may worship me. This is one of the most central themes and meanings of the Quran. This is one of the most important fundamental points of the Quran, to the point that some of the scholars have mentioned that the entire Quran is about this verse. This verse in Surah Al-Dhariyat, this verse is essentially sums up the crux of what the entire Quran is actually about. And that is about the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone without any partners. And everything that we are told in the Quran works towards that general path, that general purpose, or that general goal. And so, another of these themes that are recurrent in the Quran and constantly being repeated to us and told to us in one way or another is this verse that we opened with, and that is, قُلْ مَا يَعْبَأُ بِكُمْ رَبِّي لَوْلَا دُعَاؤُكُمْ. That you hold no merit with my Lord except by your worship of him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is essentially how an individual finds any merit, any virtue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To be anyone worthy of any mention with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will be based on your worship of Allah. That will be based on the veracity of your statements with regards to your worship and praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how we as human beings hold merit with Allah. This is what our identity is. This is how we find and really come to understand who we are and who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is and why we are here. This sense of identity is found only in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When an individual identifies himself, he identifies himself through actions that he is consistent with, through things that a person stands for, through morals that a person holds. This is how we find identity. Through our past and our origins, these things all make up who we are. This is how I identify myself. This is what makes in a person's mind their identity, their sense of purpose, what they stand for, what they stand against, their morals, their values. This is what gives them morale. And so a person who identifies himself in the way that we've just described in anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this individual has tethered himself and identified himself in something that is eventually going to decay, something that is going to run out, something that is going to cease to exist one day. If a person identifies himself through his body, identifies himself through his property or what he owns or how much money he has or how she looks, then this individual has essentially anchored themselves to something that is dissolving rapidly. And when that thing reaches its final dissolution, when that thing dissolves and disappears and is whisked away with the wind, eventually that person's identity and self of being will be as well. This is a fact of life. This is why most people are unable to deal with time and its relentless onslaught of decay that it brings along with it. A person lives in a particular moment, they value this moment, and so they try to continue to live this moment on and on for the rest of their lives. But in reality, that moment is gone, and those circumstances are no longer, and the world has moved on. And this person is still stuck in that mindset because they are afraid to move on with time, because they are afraid of losing themselves if they do so. We can see this often. You see people who, for instance, become very famous or popular during a particular time. And no matter how famous a person is, no matter how exquisite they may be or fantastic their skills are or whatever it is that they're being praised for, unless that praise is due to and that praise is coming to them by way of something that is eternal, then it's eventually going to fizzle out and go away. That's just how the world works. And so we see often that people who have that moment, have those 15 minutes of fame, that time when they seem to be on top and everyone is chattering and clamoring about them, and they're on all the magazines and the billboards and they're the hottest thing, we see that once that starts to fizzle out, they start to lose their mind. After 10 or 20 years, we find these people are seriously psychologically damaged. They're unable to come to terms with the fact that the world doesn't actually revolve around them. A person who has spent his time becoming very wealthy and accumulating wealth, and now they have started to identify themselves as a person of wealth. This is who they are. And so if poverty comes knocking on their door, they will not know how to deal with it. How can I live without these things? They feel they have lost their identity itself. And the reason for this is not because they had fame, not because they had money, not because this person, this individual had beauty, whatever it is. That's not the reason. That's only a symptom. The real reason is because they began to identify themselves through these things. They began to tether themselves and tether their identity and find purpose only in money, find purpose only in self-centeredness, find purpose only in popularity, find purpose only in physical beauty or physical strength. Only finding purpose in these things, this individual, when this thing fizzles out and decays, which is exactly the nature of everything on this earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described to us in vivid detail the luster and wonder of this world, and He said, كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. All of this illustrious, grand world, as grand as it is, as green as it is, as harmonious and beautiful and captivating and breathtaking as it is, eventually everything on it will cease to be. Everything will cease to be. And the only thing that will remain is the face of your Lord. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us. And so if a person starts to identify himself through his body or through his wealth or through his popularity or status or whatever it is, if that thing decays and goes away, which it must go away, nothing on this earth will last forever. Actually, most things on this earth having to do with human beings will last for a very, very short amount of time. That when these things fizzle out and come to an end, the person then comes to a swift end as well. The person has no identity anymore. They don't know who they are. They have an existential crisis, and they become very emotionally and psychologically damaged. And you can look around. A good place to go to look at something like that is a junkyard. Yeah, when you see those broken down, rusted, mistreated carcasses of vehicles, every one of those vehicles one day was brand new and unscratched and beautiful, and the owner thought about it many weeks or months before they bought it, and maybe even saved up for it and had a picture on his office wall because that's what he's working towards, and babied it and cleaned it and took care of it and drove it real soft. And what happened? There it is. Eventually it's going to happen. A Rolls Royce, a Maserati, whatever is a very nice car, eventually it's going to be in that cemetery of vehicles. In 100 years, all of these things, most of the things around us in 100 years are not going to be here anymore. The clothing that we're wearing, the vehicles that we're driving, the technology that we're using, and we ourselves are not going to be here anymore. Many of the buildings that we construct and build and put so much time in about 100 years, they'll probably be torn down to build something else. This is the nature of this world. If a person tries to identify himself through these things, they will fail. Rather, an individual finds his identity only in that which is everlasting, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That if a person starts to see value in himself only in the way that Allah sees value in him, meaning a person does not see value in himself based on how much money he has, based on what he has, based on what he does. Rather, a person only sees himself. When he looks in the mirror, he only sees his value as a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What have I learned today? What have I done to earn me paradise today? Forget yesterday. Yesterday is gone. Today, what have I done to earn paradise? What have I done to be someone valid with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What have I done that I am proud to meet Allah with today? This is what a person starts to look at himself. When he sees that in the mirror, that is a person who is unbreakable. That is a person who identifies himself in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And let the trials begin. Let the tribulations come. That person may be affected, and they may be hurt, and they may be in hardship, but they will never break, because that person has tethered himself to the everlasting subhanahu wa ta'ala. No matter what comes that person's way, they will be able to overcome it. They will be able to get past it, no matter what it is. Whether it's illness or disease or poverty or hardship or anything, that person will eventually come out on top, because they have a will and a spirit that is unbreakable. As Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said to the companions when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam died, what tragedy could be more heart-wrenching and terrible than the guidance of the heavens? You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guide on the earth, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam being taken away from us. What could be more terrible than that? And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu alluded to the companions and reminded them of this exact subject, this exact topic. He said to them, "Man kana ya'budu Muhammadan, fa inna Muhammadan qad mat. وَمَنْ كَانَ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ حَيٌّ لَا يَمُوتُ." He said, radiyallahu anhu, whoever was previously worshiping Muhammad, then Muhammad has passed away. He is dead. But whoever has been worshiping Allah, Allah is everlasting and will never die. He is ever living, subhanahu wa ta'ala. That this is a tragedy, but being that you are worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any tragedy can be overcome. And so, this is how a person must identify himself. If he identifies himself in any other way, he is essentially setting himself up for disaster. Nothing on this earth will last very long. There are trees that have outlasted, that have seen generations upon generations of people come in this earth and go. There are trees on this earth that have witnessed wars and the rise and fall of empires. There are trees right now on this earth that have outlived the Roman Empire, that have outlived the Muslim Empire. And so we have to understand that our little lives and our little things and our little bank accounts and our little cars, in the scheme of things, they're really nothing. They're not even a flash in the pan. Rather, the only thing that gives us merit, the only thing that gives us worth with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in turn should give us worth within ourselves, is our worship and relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is it. أقول ما تسمعون وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له هو يتولى الصالحين. وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. أما بعد, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the believers in the Quran. He describes those whom are known as Ibadur Rahman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us just before this verse that we opened with, in the same chapter, he gives us vivid descriptions and hallmarks of the people who are true servants and slaves of Ar-Rahman subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of those traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ الزُّورِ, those who do not bear witness to falsehood, those who do not bear witness to untruth. Now, this description has many meanings. It has a multitude of meanings, as do many of the verses of the Quran, if not most. There are many different meanings that this verse holds, and none of these meanings are contradicting. The verse means all of them. One of the meanings that the companions radiallahu anhum pointed out regarding this verse, those servants of Allah, of Ar-Rahman, one of their hallmarks is that they do not bear witness to falsehood. The companions alluded to one of the most prominent meanings of this verse, and that is that one of the greatest traits of the people of belief is that they do not celebrate the holidays of those who are non-Muslim. They do not celebrate the holidays of other than the Muslims. Only the Muslim holidays are the holidays that they celebrate. This is one of the meanings. Because celebration is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed. Celebration is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded in certain circumstances and not in others. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has clarified to us that we as Muslims, we have two celebrations yearly, and we have one celebration weekly, which is the day of Jumu'ah. And the celebration is to take place in such and such manner. As for other holidays, especially holidays which have pagan roots, holidays such as Christmas, holidays such as Halloween, these are pagan holidays. They come from Eastern Europe, ancient Eastern Europe, from Norse mythology and the Celtics, from people who worshipped idols and worshipped everything except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people who didn't even bathe but once a year, without exaggeration. These are holidays which root back to those days. These are not the holidays of the Muslims. A person may say, what's the big deal? The kids get to dress up and, go and get candy. And yeah, it doesn't seem like a big deal at the moment. But essentially what you're doing as a parent, which is very negligent, is you are confusing your child as to who he or she is. You're not teaching them who they are. When a person says, this is not our holiday, you're not just telling them, don't go and get candy and dress up. You're telling them, this is not who you are. Do not allow people to tell you who you are. That's what you're telling them. And when you dress your kids up and, oh, it's so cute, and you take your little pictures, you're essentially telling your children, you're not really sure who you are. What other people do, just go ahead and jump on the bandwagon and find out who you are with time. One of the greatest disservices a parent can do to his child is to not teach the child who he or she is. That is one of the greatest disservices you could do to your children. One of the greatest disservices you could do to your child as a parent is that you fail to teach your child who he is, fail to teach your child how to think for himself, how to question authority of those around him, and to refuse public pressure. If you do not teach your child this, you have not been a proper parent. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يهدينا سواء السبيل. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا، اللهم ارحمنا وتب علينا، اللهم اعف عنا، اللهم اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معصيتك، ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك، ومن اليقين ما تهون به علينا مصائب الدنيا، ومتعنا اللهم بأسماعنا وأبصارنا وقواتنا ما أحييتنا، واجعله الوارث منا، واجعل ثأرنا على من ظلمنا، وانصرنا على من عادانا. اللهم إنا نسألك عيش السعداء ومنازل الشهداء ومرافقة الأنبياء والنصر على الأعداء يا سميع الدعاء يا ذا المن والعطاء. اللهم اجعل القرآن ربيع قلوبنا ونور صدورنا وجلاء أحزاننا وذهاب همومنا. اللهم ربنا انصر الإسلام والمسلمين واخذل الشرك والمشركين وافضح النفاق والمنافقين. اللهم لا تولي علينا من لا يخافك فينا ولا يرحمنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم ردنا إليك ردا جميلا واهدنا سواء السبيل. اللهم أحينا على سنة نبيك صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم أمتنا عليها واحينا بين يديك عليها يا رب العالمين. اللهم آمين، وصل اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين، والحمد لله رب العالمين.
الله أكبر الله أكبر، أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة، حي على الفلاح، قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر، لا إله إلا الله.